So I want to make sure that I have covered some of the things in Unit 7, even though I'm not going to ask you to actually do anything other than watch this video. I'll see if I can get it into Edpuzzle. If I can do that, then I might put a couple questions at the end. If I can't, then I may just put like a big, broad kind of like reflection question on this just to make sure that you kind of watched it. But it won't be anything like an inquiry. Okay. My idea is to make this short and sweet and boom, just get it out. And so that way we will have covered the content for Unit 7, at least in kind of a superficial way, I guess you could say. So there's 3 sections to Unit 7. These are all about American politics and how politics shapes up. This is not an exhaustive list, but it does kind of put the political situation and some of the things you'll be talking about next year in relation to government. It'll be putting that within the historical context that we've been covering. So there's not really going to be new information, but I will be touching on a variety of things. And you can see, and I'll share this with you as well, so you'll have a copy of kind of these notes. But basically, this is going to be about political machines, populism, and third parties. And you can see kind of the big questions here. So the big thing about political machines had to do with the fact that they operated within local entities, and they really kind of help respond to the fact that you had all these people coming into the cities. You have urbanization, people coming in. How are we going to provide trash pickup? How are we going to provide clean water? How are we going to find them a place to live and a job? And so what will happen is these political machines will kind of come up and they'll start to provide those services for those people. Now, they don't do it for free. They expect something in exchange, and that exchange is you'll vote the way I say you'll vote. And so this allows them to control entire voting blocks, right? And by controlling these entire voting blocks, they have an incredible power, but they're also very susceptible to graft and corruption. There's numerous examples in pretty much every big city during the Gilded Age, and places like New York, Tammany Hall, the construction of the New York City Hall building, classic example of what happens with that level of graft and kind of corruption. And I have a couple pictures down here of the party boss, passing out favors, and kind of the idea that these, and this one right here, these guys are bringing votes to the top of the pyramid, getting jobs and gigs and construction work and all that kind of stuff, and they're going back down. So that's really kind of what you see happening with political machines. And we covered this when we talked about immigration and kind of the challenges with immigration. And so the political machines, they go from that kind of very local, very literally neighborhoods, right, into cities, into counties, into states, into the national system. And you would have a national boss that really controlled, who got what job offers, who got what opportunities. So it becomes this really powerful organization. But there's some resentment to this. There's resentment at the city level and at the county level because you're middle class, right? The Gilded Age sees a growth in middle class. They resent the power of the political machines. They feel like uneducated voters are getting the chance to have a say, and because they vote in voting blocks, they have more power than well-meaning middle class people. And so there becomes this tension about the political machines. And what happens, is it democratic for a political machine to control votes and to control what companies get what jobs and to do all that kind of stuff? And is that the way government is supposed to be run? And the answer, of course, that social gospel people, middle class reformers, and later progressives will say is no, right? That's not democratic, right? Now, there's a tension there because these are the voters that, their answer to poverty and people that live in tenements is, well, we're going to tell you how to live. We're going to control your alcohol consumption. We're going to try to tell you how many kids to have. We're going to send your kids to school. We're going to try to control your life, right? So there's a tension there, right? And depending on the boss, right? I mean, some people could be very happy with this exchange. I give them my votes, and he takes care of my neighborhood and make sure there's not a dead horse in the street and all that kind of stuff. So there's tensions that exist there. But fundamentally, what will happen because of the graft and the corruption in the political machines will result in what is essentially an expansion of democracy. But again, that question about democracy is whose values, right? I mean, I've mentioned this multiple times, right? When we look at the preamble to the Constitution, or if we think about Alexis de Tocqueville's values, we all have different opinions, different feelings, different priorities. So whose democratic values are more important? Are yours more important than mine? Are mine more important than my 80-year-old mother's? Are they more important than my 18-year-old son? Right? I mean, so there's a tension about whose values should really determine the direction of government. And that tension hasn't gone away, right? We still have it. But you really see, kind of because of the political machines, the rise of progressivism, a series of major reforms, the settlement house movement, and I mentioned this before, in part to kind of help immigrant communities, the working poor, have somebody to go to help fix the problems in their neighborhood so they don't have to go to a political machine. You start to have city council government, right? One of the things that happens in Galveston, Texas, is there's a major hurricane, and when the city is rebuilt, they completely change the structure of the city government so that you have these at-large seats, so that you don't necessarily have these neighborhood blocks that can vote together. And so that is seen as an extension of democracy, more democratic, except that, is it? Whose values are being represented? You've got secret ballots. People can vote in private, so nobody can know who you voted for. Initiative, where voters can put something on a ballot. You can collect enough signatures and get people to sign up for it. Referendum. If people want to express their opinion, referendums are often done. Initiatives and referendums can be done when you have a community that often, let's build a park here, let's build a library, or let's, limit, the construction of some kind of industry in this particular neighborhood, or that kind of thing. And so you have these referendums, and you have recalls that allow for voters to recall corrupt politicians, right, to remove them from office. Now, that's not an impeachment. That's just simply the voters saying, we changed our mind. We don't like this guy. We want him out of office. So those are progressive responses that expand democracy, and they are a direct challenge to the political machine. This is why we see the political machines declining as we move into the 20th century. And by and large, they stay pretty weak. It's not really until you get to about the 1990s and the early 2000s when you start to have political action committees that you see a different type of political machine. Nowadays, these PACs, these super PACs, they formulate, they're able to kind of put so much money behind certain people or certain ideas that they can propel those to the forefront of the agenda. And that's not quite the same as a political machine, because you don't typically have the one guy at the top that's the kingmaker, But you do definitely see that there's this question about how democratic it is, right? So I would suggest that we're not totally done with political machines. They just look very different than what they did in the Gilded Age. But you do have this idea of political machines, that frustration with that system propels a lot of change. Now, part of where that comes from is the idea of populism. Populism at its most basic is the popular will of the people, that people get together and they get so frustrated that they impact politics, right? There's several different kinds of populist parties. And so we can talk about populism with a little p, or populist with a little p, and that's going to be the will of the people, right? But then you have populist, big P, parties, right? And the first of these is going to be known as the People's Party, or sometimes also referred to as the Populist Party. And they kind of come out of this whole period after, when you had Reconstruction, the Homestead Act, and the, people moving out west, and you had all these farmers. And remember, we talked about the frustrations of farmers trying to make it as a farmer on the Great Plains and how difficult that really was. And they feel very vulnerable to the tariffs and to the railroad companies and to the big business and to the banks. And they feel like politics is making all these decisions based on the needs of big business and manufacturing, not on the needs of these farmers that have moved out west. And so they are incredibly frustrated with this. And like we saw with union activity, remember, workers form together. They see the consolidation of all these businesses, right? And these businesses get bigger and bigger and bigger, and they're able to control wages, they're able to control prices, they're able to control supply. They can, if you try to stand up for a union, they can lock you out of the industry. It creates a lot of problems on down the road. And so what you'll see is that unions are created to oppose big business consolidation. And in many ways, farmers consolidate to do the same thing. Now they're arguing against, rather than Standard Oil or Carnegie's U.S. Steel, they're arguing against an entire system, right? So initially, their first efforts, the Grange, the state exchanges, the Farmers Alliance, are really pretty small attempts to try to make that happen. Not always very successful. The Grange is really kind of voluntary, more about sharing information. The Farmers Alliance and the state exchanges were about farmers kind of banding their resources together to negotiate better shipping rates or better loan rates, that kind of thing. But those come under threat. Just like we saw with unions, they get accused of trying to violate free trade and free choice, and they're not being laissez-faire. And it's out of that frustration and the fact that several of these state exchanges and alliances fail, that you're going to have the creation of the People's Party, right? And this is the Populist Party. And it's complicated. And I put a couple of links here to some, let's see if I get this to pull up, to some American YOP documents, because I wanted to just kind of point those out. You do have a document analysis coming up that's not too far away, which I need to post about that. So you can have here in this Grover Cleveland vetoes the seed bill. Grover Cleveland, so farmers in Texas had been devastated, and there's a bill to try to help the farmers recover, that they're just basically the government's, think of it as a stimulus check, right? Oh, the farmers in Texas are hurting, so we're going to just give them seeds so they can replant, right? They don't have to go out and buy them. We're just going to give it to them, not worry about it. And Grover Cleveland vetoes this bill. He says, no, this is not the role of government. This is not what we're supposed to do. And so he vetoes the bill and says, if people want to donate seed, that's up to them, but I'm not going to force the government and other people to have to participate in the system. And so you have kind of this idea of a rejection of one of these kind of core needs of the farmers, right? So they're going to get pretty frustrated by that. And so this is part of how you're going to end up with what is called the Omaha platform of the People's Party. And this platform has a whole lot to do with gold and silver. If you know anything about Wizard of Oz, the gold and silver issue. Farmers wanted silver because silver was more flexible, there was more available. It would loosen up the money supply, make interest rates lower, make it easier to borrow money, all that kind of stuff. And so they want to change kind of the money supply. They also talk about kind of having these this national exchange where the government buys up surplus crops. They tend to talk about a number of issues for the working class, right? So they try to make themselves appealing to workers again. So you've got this kind of unionization of farmers with the unionization of workers, that the railroad should be owned by the nation, not by railroad companies. Postal savings banks, if you've ever heard anything about that, graduated income tax, right? So we won't rely on tariffs anymore. We'll have an income tax system. And, that basically the railroad companies that own all this excess land, they have to give it up. And there should be a free ballot, right? Fair elections, secret ballot. That's what the Australian or secret ballot system is. Again, that graduated tax, pensions for Union soldiers, not Confederate soldiers, and kind of, providing term limits, getting rid of the Pinkerton system. Pinkertons were really violent to labor unions. And just really kind of going after some of those issues that were a hot button issue in the late Gilded Age. And so that's what they're really trying to address. And then I shared a link here to something in the the American Yop that's from the Colored Farmers Alliance. And so the Farmers Alliance would have white and black versions, right? Because it's the 1800s. And so integration is, a strange idea. And what's going to end up happening is that, the South is very agricultural. So you would think the Farmers Alliance would be very popular in the South. Except remember, there's a lot of sharecroppers, there's a lot of tenant farmers, which means the landowners aren't so sure they like all of this crazy talk that the People's Party is going on about. And they're also concerned because the farmers' alliances have allowed for African American versions, right? And so really a lot of the voter suppression that we see coming out of the South has a whole lot to do with the rise of the alliance, the rise of the People's Party. So there's a big backlash. So you'd have to kind of dovetail Jim Crow segregation in with kind of the rise of the People's Party to really get a full grasp of just how extensive the voter suppression was. And so you come from that. So the People's Party, they run a presidential candidate. They win a few state races. They will eventually have William Jennings Bryan, who's actually a Democrat, but he's, he's a Democrat that's incredibly, he believes in the silver issue. He supports a lot of what the People's Party does. So very much, think about Sanders running for the Democratic ticket, right? So Bernie Sanders running for the Democratic ticket, everybody, he's a Democrat socialist. Well, William Jennings Bryan isn't exactly like that, but he's close. He's in that neighborhood, right? He's somebody who's very, very populist in his thinking, even though he's technically affiliated with the Democratic Party. And he gains a lot of traction. And so he will run for president like 4 different times. And so he, he keeps running and running. But people tend to see him as a little bit radical. They tend to see anything affiliated with the Populist Party as radical. So part of what will happen in 1896 is William McKinley will start to coalesce a group of kind of progressive-minded Republicans. And so McKinley will kind of get them, and he'll kind of start to balance some issues. Yes, we've got to have a little bit of social reform, a little bit of economic reform. We've got to have a little bit of regulation, So you start to see those changes taking place, and that starts to happen, and it makes it much harder for William Jennings Bryan to gain traction after that. And so it'll be the progressives, Teddy Roosevelt, William Taft, Woodrow Wilson, and both the Democratic and Republican parties, right? That will be the ones that will kind of navigate more of a middle course between the People's Party and the populists and government ownership of railroads and government ownership of all this extra land and all this kind of stuff with kind of the pro-business, we don't care about people suffering and, dead horses in streets and stuff. And so that's kind of what you see happening. Now, Teddy Roosevelt will run in 1912 under the Progressive Party banner. So he will try to unify the Progressive Party, but that won't work. And we'll talk about the 1912 election here in a bit. And I've got a couple of cartoons. This one right here shows William Jennings Bryan eating the Democratic Party. So kind of depicts that. And this is a patchwork for the People's Party, right? In other words, the People's Party try to create a platform that appeals to a lot of different groups, that if they can get a coalition together of all these different groups, unions and farmers and people of color and, Greenback Party and all that kind of stuff, that maybe they can get enough support to challenge the two main parties. And that just, this is the problem with third parties. They don't usually win, right? In fact, they don't win. At best, they make a strong showing, but they're still not going to win. And ultimately what's going to happen is they're going to skew the election results. So Roosevelt's Progressive Party pulls votes away from William Howard Taft, right? Now, the People's Party, they aren't really in contention so much for any kind of national office, so they don't pull votes away, but we definitely see that with the Progressive Party. And either way, we see that those parties do kind of push the Democrats and Republicans to accept some other ideas, right? Your next group of populists, these are going to be the ones that come about during FDR and the Great Depression. Huey Long, a chicken in every pot, we're going to put limits on how much money people can make. Father Coughlin, we're going to nationalize the banks. So they come out, FDR hasn't gone far enough. I threw this on here because I thought it was super interesting. So one of the things that we don't often talk about is kind of the American Fascist Party, right? And so this guy by the name of Pelly had created this silver shirts, and this link, I think the Huey Long link takes you to an American Yop by Huey Long, but the link for Pelly and the silver shirts takes you to a Wikipedia article that I've read through. So it's not crazy talk or anything. It's a legitimate Wikipedia page. But he actually runs as kind of this anti-communism kind of fascist party, right? And believing in kind of this idea that we shouldn't get involved in World War II. We shouldn't worry about, Nazi Germany and all this kind of stuff. And you have him really, really claiming those ideas. And so he's kind of interesting. I don't know if you've watched, Man in the High Castle, or if you've watched, what is the one that just was on HBO? Something about the plot against America. So you've got, this is a real thing. So Pelly and these silver shirts kind of embody another type of populist party that's emerging in the 1930s. So it's not just Huey Long and Father Coughlin who are coming, saying, oh, FDR's not done enough. You've got people on the other side, Charles Lindbergh and the America First Committee, and you've got Pelly and the silver shirts that are saying, oh, we can't trust FDR. He's too much like a communist, right? We need to do something against him. So you have these tensions going on there. And I noted here that part of the creation of the House Un-American Activities Committee starts in the 1930s, and it starts because of the silver shirts, right? And so FDR and the New Deal are going to kind of be this in-between between these two extremes, right? And we don't often think about that. We think about the New Deal as being kind of this really dramatic period in American history, and it is. But understand that this is a middle course that a lot of countries really struggled to make, right? And what will kind of happen as we go through this period of World War II, when you get into the 1950s, Joseph McCarthy really is the one who kind of picks up that mantle of populism. And this is how he gains that traction for the Red Scare and for going after people and the use of HUAC. So that's where that origin comes from, right? And it's out of Joseph McCarthy, that you have this idea of Goldwater and the Goldwater campaign in 1964. And Goldwater was, really kind of hardcore anti-communist, was willing to use nuclear weapons. This is why LBJ has that famous mushroom cloud commercial, right? And so, you have a lot of debates going on about, where does anti-communism fit in with that? And so then you also have these concerns. Democrats are very concerned about McCarthyism and anti-communism, and it just kind of leads to some interesting ideas. You also have, coming out of this period, the John Birch Society. They're a big conspiracy theory group. But they're kind of the remnants. So you've got these little remnants of these kind of populist parties after the Great Depression and World War II that kind of wander around in the wilderness, whether it's Goldwater having lost the 64 election, whether it's the John Birch Society and all their conspiracy theories, whether it's Joseph McCarthy. And so they kind of mill about, right? And it's into that context that you have the civil rights movement, right? And this is going to lead to what I would consider the third kind of populist movement. This is going to come from George Wallace in the state of Alabama. In 1968, he's going to run on his segregation party. So he'll be challenging Hubert Humphrey and Richard Nixon. And he's opposed to desegregation, opposed to civil rights. And you start to have this change in the South, right, beginning in 68. And you actually kind of start seeing it happen as early as 1948 when Truman integrates the U.S. military. And so Strom Thurmond and a group of Democrats that start to call themselves Dixiecrats, because remember that Truman is actually a Democrat, right? But he's not that kind of Democrat. And so that group is going to begin to identify themselves a little bit differently. It's into that George Wallace is going to run his segregation campaign in 1968. And so this will begin to coalesce people, Southerners, people that supported Goldwater, that felt like, that they don't trust kind of the more moderate Republicans. They're going to begin to coalesce. And so what will happen is by the time you get to the mid 1970s, you're going to have a pretty strong coalition of really conservative people that come from those backgrounds, right? And so you're going to start to see that populist element begins to have a strong influence in the Republican Party. And the Democrats, on the other hand, don't really have that, right? So they're kind of struggling with how do they figure out, who they are and how do they run and that sort of thing as we're going into the 1970s. The next kind of populist party that you have is going to be around 1992. H. Ross Perot, Texas businessman, is upset in 1992 because Bush 41, George H.W. Bush, had, he says he's not going to raise taxes, and then he ends up doing it. And he does it because the economy's hurting after the Gulf War, and he needs to kind of get the economy moving again. And so he decides to reach out across the aisle to the Democrats, and the Democrats say, well, we'll cut some spending, but you've got to raise some taxes. And so he kind of compromises, just as politicians should, except that H. Ross Perot comes out and says, oh, no, I can't believe you did that, right? And so he really starts tackling and challenging George W. Bush or George H.W. Bush, going after him. And he gets 13% of the national vote. Now, he doesn't get any electoral votes, but he does get, it's a pretty strong showing after, Roosevelt's 1912 election. And so what you're going to see is that, you have him really kind of questioning government spending, government programs, the nature of government we've seen since the Great Society, what I would call fiscal conservatism, and allowing business the chance to operate. You start to have, as we move into the 90s, special interest groups happening. You also have the rise of what I would call moral conservatism, people that really kind of reject the way people are living their lives. They're concerned about, gay marriage or homosexuality. They're concerned about loose sexual mores. They're concerned about women working outside the home, all those kinds of things. And so these kind of elements that may not necessarily align behind Ross Perot, but they're there, and they begin to influence the Republican Party of the 21st century. And in addition, they influence the Democratic Party to become more conservative. So you see that under the Clintons, right, they embrace welfare reform and welfare regulation. They embrace law and order, right, the crime bill that put so many people in jail. You have the don't ask, don't tell policy. If you're gay in the military, just don't say anything, right? So they embrace a lot of kind of conservative ideas. So the 1990s is really a period of conservatism that's being driven by kind of these elements of populism that really go back, if you will, to around this period of George Wallace coming out of Joseph McCarthy and all that kind of stuff. So in some ways, those more conservative populist groups are still responding to some extent to FDR and the New Deal. They're still responding to LBJ and the Great Society. The next group of populists are going to be your Tea Party and your Occupy Wall Street. This is post-2008 economic crisis. And they get upset over a lot of different things. Part of it is frustration about bank bailouts and big business bailouts. We see some of that right now. People questioning, why this company got this money or why this, all this kind of. So you've got the same kind of questions, people aren't going to go get jobs because they got their unemployment checks. And, so all this frustration with economic bailouts, right? This idea of putting money in people's hands so they can participate in the economy because otherwise the economy will freeze up, right? Well, people get frustrated with that. And so they have a big reaction. So Occupy Wall Street's really against corporate interests. The Tea Party is really against taxes, what they perceive as taxes and not being used well. And this gets worse after Obama gets elected. So it's kind of hard to separate some of the economic stuff from some of what was a real reaction to the election of a Democratic president. And in 2008, you have a Democratic sweep, right? They control both houses of Congress and the presidency. And so there was a lot of upset about that. And so some of that is due to the Democrats being in control. You also have media kind of talking a lot about it. So media is a big part of this. And a lot of these groups, will eventually kind of fritter away. They'll kind of fracture into a bunch of other specific groups. And we see some of those, if you think about the Charlottesville riots, right? So some of this has led to the rise of white supremacy, or Antifa. And so they have come out of this kind of fifth populist movement. So you still kind of have those radical populists around. They've kind of simmered and kind of quieted down for a little bit, but it's hard to say. And then I put on here the sixth populist. This wasn't necessarily in the curriculum, but I thought it would make sense. Because there's a lot of political science critique that Trump's movement and Bernie Sanders' movement are both elements of populism. That because Trump does not hold kind of stereotypical Republican values, in other words, I put on here he opposes big business. It's not that he opposes big business, but he opposes trade agreements and global trade. He says he doesn't like businesses taking jobs overseas, so he wants to regulate or control businesses in some ways and not in others. His anti-immigration stance is not a big business friendly stance, right? And big businesses like immigrant labor because it's cheap. And so he does some things that don't fit within that agenda. And he also does not see the U.S. as a global leader. And he builds a lot of his support from the grassroots, from ordinary people that say, hey, I think he speaks for me. And so that is part of why I would kind of call him a populist. And I think Bernie Sanders does the same thing. He's opposed to corporations and government support of corporations, and that includes tax agendas and certain tax breaks. I mean, his views are a little nuanced from Trump's, but kind of in big broad strokes, they have some commonalities, right? Which is surprising. You have Bernie Sanders is much more concerned about domestic issues than he's ever been over kind of foreign policy. Now, when he was running in the primary here recently, he did have a few more foreign policy things, but still not a huge part of what his campaign was about. And he too has lots of grassroots. And in both cases, Trump, solidified the Republican Party. You see the Trump agenda really controlling things, even when, the Republican Party doesn't always, some of your big business people don't always agree. But they toe the line. They do what Donald Trump wants. And I think that, we see that Biden has locked in the Democratic nomination. But the progressive changes that Bernie Sanders has promoted, or even Elizabeth Warren, they're going to be there. Now, we don't know exactly what that's going to look like, but they are going to be there. And so again, you've got William Jennings Bryan from the Gilded Age, Huey Long from the 1930s, George Wallace from the 1960s, Ross Perot from the 1990s. And to some extent, Donald Trump in 2016. And so third parties tend to affect elections. Remember 1860, we had four different parties running, and it really kind of regionalized the election. 1892, the Populist Party, right? This is going to lead to kind of this propelling for change. And so you're going to see William McKinley, kind of brings in a more progressive wing, including Teddy Roosevelt. So Teddy Roosevelt and the progressive movement will really control the first decade of the 20th century. In 1912, when Teddy Roosevelt comes back, he could have run again, but he chooses not to because he basically had already served 2 terms because McKinley was shot so early in 1901. And so he says, okay, I'm not going to run. William Howard Taft is my guy. He's going to keep doing all these great things that I had started. And he goes on safari. And then when he comes back, he feels like Taft is working too much with Congress. He's not controlling Congress enough. And so he challenges Taft for the Republican nomination, but he loses, right? So Taft manages to hold on to the Republican nomination. So Teddy Roosevelt goes and creates his own political party, his own progressive party. And, he kind kind of is trying to bring in all this progressive movement. And so the 1912 election is really more between Woodrow Wilson and Teddy Roosevelt than it is with Taft and Roosevelt, or Taft and Wilson. But what will happen in 1912 is Teddy Roosevelt will pull votes away from Taft. And by pulling votes away from Taft, he and Taft split those Republican votes, which leaves only Democrats to vote for Wilson. So Wilson gets the election in large part because of the divided Republican vote. We see the same thing happening in 1992. Ross Perot runs. Where does he pull his support from? Bush 41. So Bush 41 is not going to have the votes he needs to defeat Clinton. So Clinton wins in 92, but largely because Ross Perot had split the vote with George W. Bush, right? And so you start to have kind of these issues with third parties. When they run, they do tend to, embody some element of change. But if you have an election with more than two political parties, you're going to have a vote that's divided, a vote that's split off, that doesn't actually represent the true will of the people. The election of 2000 is another one, and that's hyperlinked to a discussion about the 2000 election. So Ralph Nader, had run for the Green Party on a big environmental ticket. And Al Gore was a big environmentalist, but and really Nader wasn't even in the running. He wasn't even close. But the big debate has been, did he pull just enough votes in Florida away from Al Gore that Al Gore was not able to win in Florida? Okay. It's hard to know how, because there's a lot of what ifs, ands, and buts about Nader and Florida in 2000. The big thing is that, did that affect the vote counting? It does raise this question because Bush 43, when George W. Bush wins in 2000, he wins not because he has the popular vote. He wins because he gets the Electoral College. He gets to 270 first. And so you start to have increasing questions about the Electoral College, and is it a valid way to elect and choose a president? And then you have the same thing happening in 2016, right, where Donald Trump did not win the popular vote, but he did win the Electoral College. And so what does that mean, right? How do we understand that? And so there's a lot of interesting questions to think about with the Electoral College. Is it good or is it bad? That kind of thing. And that's for you to decide. There's benefits to it in the sense that it gives states that don't have a lot of population, a little more of a say in who the president's going to be. But on the other hand, it allows states without a lot of population to have a say. When your economic centers are Texas, California, and New York, why should little bitty, Wyoming be able to have an outsized say in the presidency or in how the direction of the country? Well, except that we're a democracy and they should have a say. Right. So it's complicated. There's not a neat answer. But the 2000 and 2016 elections do raise this question. And we do see this. This is why third parties are not good in elections. It's not as simple as just, I'm going to run a third party campaign. No, because you're going to pull votes away from somebody. And that can skew the election pretty significantly. Now, it doesn't against FDR, but FDR has a lot of support, right? So that's kind of the difference. So that kind of runs through a little bit about political machines, populism, third parties, kind of gives you this overview of it. So hopefully that kind of helps you understand, as you move into government next year and all that kind of stuff, what populism and third parties are all about.